The next item of business is a debate on motion 20815 in the name of Katie Clark on the Freedom of Information Reform Scotland Bill at stage 1. I'd be grateful if members who wish to speak in the debate were to press their request to speak buttons now. And I call on Katie Clark, the member in charge, to speak to and move the motion.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I move the motion. It's been almost 25 years since the introduction of the Freedom of Information Scotland Act 2002, known as FOISA. This bill is not a criticism of that legislation, which has been a great success. Indeed, it's the same people who campaigned for that legislation who have been campaigning for this bill. People such as the Campaign for Freedom of Information in Scotland, people such as the prominent FOI campaigner, the late Jim Wallace, who took FOISA through this Parliament. In May 2020, as a result of campaigning for freedom of information reform, along the lines proposed today, the Procedures and Public Appointments Committee produced a report with a range of recommendations and concluded that whilst the 2002 Act had significantly improved transparency, urgent update of the law was needed. The provisions of this bill were drafted based on that committee report, the recommendations of all 4 Information Commissioners who have held that post since the 2002 Act, and indeed the consultation on this bill and previous consultations. It is a reflection of the proposals from Freedom of Information campaigners, practitioners and indeed the Information Commissioners. This bill closes loopholes, strengthens the power of the Information Commissioner and makes proposals to address the reduction in freedom of information coverage since the 2002 Act. Significant work has been carried out with the Information Commissioner, his policy and legal experts and others to ensure this bill is workable. I understand the concerns being raised about parliamentary time, but my concern is that no proposals have been brought forward by the Scottish Government since the 2020 committee report. And I fear that if the bill fails to pass stage 1 today, we will have the same debate again in 5 years' time with no proposals still forthcoming from Scottish ministers. Whether it is in local government, justice, transport or social care, private companies have increasingly become major providers of public services but are not covered by current freedom of information laws. For example, when ferry services are publicly owned and funded, they are covered by freedom of information. But that is not the case when they are publicly funded but run by private providers such as Serco North Link. Council houses had previously been subject to freedom of information, but when council houses were subject to stock transfer to bodies like housing associations, that was no longer the case. And it took 13 years of campaigning before information rights were reinstated by the current minister. However, in most other areas, rights which have been lost over the last 25 years have still not been reinstated. The committee in the last Parliament and this committee's Stage 1 report are right to conclude that legislation is now needed to update the freedom of information regime in Scotland and that the Scottish Government has been slow to exercise its powers under the Act. The Scottish Government have been asked to bring forward legislation over a number of parliaments but have failed to do so. And that is why I've brought this Members' Bill forward today. I was approached in 2021 when I was first elected into this Parliament and asked if I would proceed if this government would not. I welcome the committee's support for some of the provisions in the bill. They supported a requirement for the Scottish Government to consider proposals brought forward by the Information Commissioner to extend bodies that need to comply with freedom of information. They backed bringing companies jointly owned. I'll take an intervention from Graham Simpson.
Graham Simpson.
I thank Katie Clark for taking the intervention. Would she agree with me that the government could have taken on this bill, as it could with any member's bill, but chose not to, and that shows they don't have an appetite for this?
Katie Clark.
With the point the member makes, The committee backed bringing companies jointly owned by the Scottish Government and other bodies into the scope of FOI law. The committee recognised that the First Minister's veto power was unnecessary, and of course the First Minister has refused to rule out using the veto in relation to the various current court cases. The committee recognised the benefit of other provisions in the bill, such as the need for statutory freedom of information officers and greater enforcement powers for the Information Commissioner. The bill includes provisions recommended by the committee in the last Parliament for a legal duty for proactive publication in line with best international practice and recommended by all 4 Information Commissioners that have held the post and in accordance with codes of practice provided by the Information Commissioner. The bill includes a new offence for destroying records with intent to prevent disclosure before a freedom of information request is made, and that provision mirrors existing offences that relate to after an FOI request has been made. This is a power needed and supported by the Information Commissioner, but has a high test of criminal intent, so would only be used in extreme cases. The bill also enables the committee system of this Parliament to act where the Scottish Government fails to do so. That would mean, for example, if the Scottish Government fails to come forward with proposals to extend freedom of information to the whole of the care sector, or indeed parts of it, or even 1 or 2 organisations, a committee could then come forward with proposals. I very much look forward to hearing members' contributions in this debate today, and will address some of the other issues connected with the bill, such as costs, in my closing speech. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now call on Sue Webber to move Amendment 20815.1.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I move the amendment in my name. Freedom of information is not an abstract constitutional principle. It's the cornerstone of public trust in Scotland's institutions, and it's how people understand what their government is doing, how decisions are made, and whether power is being exercised responsibly. Yet, despite clear and compelling evidence that our FOI framework is outdated and outpaced, the Scottish Government has consistently failed to modernise it. The Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee could not have been clearer. There is a need for FOI reform. Our original 2002 Act was designed for a totally different era, before digital comms, before ALIO's service delivery, before the complex landscape of public-funded but not public-listed bodies. The world has moved on, and Scotland's FOI regime has not kept pace. But what we have witnessed from the Scottish Government over recent years is a refusal to accept that reality. Ministers insist that the fundamentals are still fit for purpose. Yet we heard the Information Commissioner describe that their pace on bringing new bodies forward under FOI as glacial. Stakeholders told us the publication scheme is outdated and ineffective. Public functions remain exempt simply because they sit outside traditional structures. And none of that is, frankly, fit for purpose. Presiding Officer, freedom of information is supposed to empower the public, not exhaust them. It should encourage transparency, not create barriers to it. And I want to give credit to Katie Clark, MSP, for taking on this work, because nobody else had any appetite to do so. She's done so because the Scottish Government has simply chosen not to do so. And while it's true that many elements of the bill need further refinement, and that's a euphemism, the need for reform is not in dispute. It is urgent, it is overdue, and it's undeniable. However, the Conservatives are finding ourselves between a rock and a hard place today. The Stage 1 report sets out substantial, complex work that would be required to make this bill fully workable, future-proofed and comprehensive, and the time left in this session is extremely tight. Some might call it legislative constipation. And at that same time, constituents are watching. One wrote to me saying, "It feels like every time FOI comes up, Parliament asks for more time, while the law gets older and weaker. The frustration is real, and it reflects a wider public concern that delay looks a lot like protecting the government from scrutiny." Presiding Officer, I have lodged the amendment today that reflects the reality before us. It states that while the Parliament agrees to the principles of the bill, we must also recognise the time pressure on the current session and the views expressed in the Stage 1 report, including that FOI reform may ultimately need to be addressed in the new Parliament. This isn't backing away from reform. It's being honest about the scale of the task ahead. And let me be clear, the Scottish Conservatives will vote for the bill at Stage 1. We do so because the principles are sound and because Scotland cannot afford more drift. But supporting the principles does not erase our concerns. We are deeply worried about the sheer length of time and level of work required to resolve the issues identified by the committee. Progress must be real and not symbolic. Presiding Officer, the public are watching this debate more closely than some in this chamber may realise. They are demanding transparency and not excuses. They expect us to strengthen their right to know, not to circle the wagons and shield the Scottish Government from scrutiny. And the truth is, every time the FOI reform is delayed, resisted or redirected into yet another holding pattern, it reinforces the perception that those in power are more interested in protecting themselves than serving the public interest. People can see the government dragging its heels. They can see when loopholes remain open, when enforcement powers remain weak, and when proactive publication is talked about but never delivered. And they are rightly asking, if you believe in openness, why won't you modernise the law that guarantees it? So let me be clear. This Parliament has a duty, not to ministers, not to departments, to the people of Scotland. They are entitled to a system that is modern, transparent and future-proofed. They are watching what we choose to do today, and they will judge us not on our words about transparency, but whether we actually deliver it for once. Presiding Officer, by supporting the bill today and my amendment, while being frank about the reality of what remains to be done, we keep the pressure on the Scottish Government. We send a clear message that IFOI reform cannot be allowed to drift into irrelevance, and we reaffirm that the public's right to know must be strengthened, modernised and defended, both now and in the next Parliament. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. And I now call on Martin Whitfield on behalf of the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee.
I'm very grateful, Presiding Officer, and I rise as convener of Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee. And firstly, I would like to thank everyone who contributed to our scrutiny of the bill at Stage 1. We had the opportunity to hear from academics, from public bodies, from both information requesters and those who respond to them. We heard from the Scottish Information Commissioner, the Minister, and of course we heard from Ms Clark MSP, the sponsoring MSP for this bill. In this contribution, I'd like to set out the committee's main conclusions on the bill. Turning first to the designation of public bodies. The bill proposes alternative mechanisms for designating public bodies under FOISA on the basis that the Scottish Government has been slow in using its powers in this regard. This view was shared by many stakeholders, with the Commissioner describing the pace of designation as glacial. The committee had no concerns about providing for the Government to consider the Commissioner's proposals on designation. However, we did have reservations on the proposals that Parliament have the power to designate. In our view, the process for using such power has not been sufficiently considered or laid out in the bill, and so we cannot determine whether this power would deliver on either faster pace of designation or indeed lead to more designations. Similarly, the proposal for the Parliament to scrutinise the Government Section 5 reports on designation does need greater detail. The bill has several provisions aimed at improving compliance with information requests. It proposes the 20 working day limit for compliance be paused rather than reset when a public body seeks a clarification. We heard that some requesters may have experienced clarifications being used as delaying tactic, but there is a lack of data to determine the extent of such practice. And while some stakeholders thought this proposal would improve the relationship between public bodies and information requesters, others cautioned that it could lead to poorer responses and impact on frontline services. We think further detailed work is needed to assess the impact that such change might have. And while we saw merit in the proposals for providing the Commissioner with greater powers, particularly requiring individuals to give evidence, we thought these issues again required more detailed consideration by the Scottish Government. However, we were not persuaded by the Government's argument that the First Minister's veto power should be retained, as there are other safeguards that exist regarding disclosure of sensitive information. The bill also intended to promote a broader cultural change within public bodies towards greater openness and transparency. Provisions such as introducing proactive publication, requiring authorities to create a statutory FOI office role, and a new offence in relation to the destruction of information could all be seen as part of such cultural change. However, we did have concerns about whether the bill could deliver this. We note the arguments in favour of the presumption in favour of disclosure in Section 1, but the necessity and material effect of these changes are unclear, given that stakeholders noted such a provision is already provided for within the existing FOISA. Furthermore, although we agree that introducing proactive publication duty would reflect the original intention of the Freedom of Information Act, we note the concerns of stakeholders about the potential cost and the challenges of the proposal, and again we think further consultation is required. We found the financial memorandum to be largely speculative on the potential for this proposal to lead to savings. We did not think that the Section 18 proposal to create an offence of destroying information with the intent to prevent disclosure in the absence of an information request was appropriate or indeed proportionate approach towards delivering cultural change. So in conclusion, the Freedom of Information reform is complex and is a substantial complex endeavour. The work done by Ms Clark in bringing forward this bill has been incredibly valuable in highlighting that there is indeed the need to absolutely update the Freedom of Information regime here in Scotland. However, given the need for greater development of many of the bill's provisions, we do not think this bill is the most effective vehicle for delivering that change. Instead, the committee considers that the Scottish Government should, by using its resource, to take the legislative action to update Freedom of Information. But if the Government is unwilling, then we suggest a committee bill may be required in the next Parliament. We agree with the need for Freedom of Information reform, but for the reasons set out, we do not recommend that this Parliament agrees to the general principles of the bill. I'm grateful.
Thank you. I now call on the Minister.
Presiding Officer, in the extremely limited time I have at my disposal today, I want to begin by acknowledging the significant contribution to the debate on FOI rights and the responsibility of such made by Katie Clark. She is to be commended for ensuring Parliament has an opportunity to reflect on the successes of current FOI legislation and, of course, debate areas where improvement could be made. I particularly want to thank the Standards Committee for producing such a considered report. Whilst they found areas to support in the bill, they also noted the substantial further work that would be required and that there is not sufficient time for this in the current session to do so, and as Sue Webber's amendment also acknowledges. That's why the committee recommended Parliament does not agree to the general principles of the bill. And I accept that recommendation, just as I also accept Sue Webber's amendment, which makes the same point. And as Minister for Parliamentary Business, I can absolutely testify to how busy this Parliament will be in finalising legislation in the 5 weeks we have left. However, I want to be clear that the Scottish Government believes that this bill and the committee's report provide solid foundations for the next Parliament to consider how it builds on FOI legislation. Presiding Officer, Scotland has had strong... very briefly, will I get my time back, Presiding Officer? Right.
Graham Simpson.
Well, can I thank the Minister for taking the intervention? Would the Minister agree with me that Parliament is not being asked to decide whether there is enough time to get this bill through? It's been asked to decide whether it agrees with the general principles of the bill, and that is all. Minister.
I'm sure Mr Simpson was listening. If he listened to Sue Webber's points, and specifically the convener's points, about the many issues there are in the bill, it is impossible, it would be impossible in the 5 weeks remaining to undertake the tasks that have been laid out by the committee. That is the reality here, and we have to deal, I'm afraid, in reality, Mr Simpson. Presiding Officer, Scotland has had strong and internationally well-regarded laws on freedom of information for over 21 years, and I pay tribute to Jim Wallace for his part in that. He transformed access to information about government and public services. Last year, over 109,000 information requests were handled across the public sector, with 87.5% resulting in the release of information. I think that shows the legislation is delivering to its main purpose of providing information and developing a more open and transparent culture. But of course, there are areas that can be improved upon. FOI law has important strengths, but it's right that we consider areas for improvement. Extension of FOISA has been pursued far more actively in Scotland than in the rest of the UK. In 2013, coverage was extended to local authority, culture and leisure trust. In 2016, to grant-aided and independent special schools and private prisons. In 2019, extension to registered social landlords brought around 200 new bodies under FOISA. And we're the only part of the UK to have done this. But I acknowledge, I think, to a point from Katie Clark at committee, that I do think the process, much as a process is needed, can be clunky at times. I think there are areas this could be improved upon. So we're currently consulting on designating independent care homes and care-at-home providers. This would be the most significant extension to date and could see around 2,000 services delivered by around 1,000 different organisations, subject to FOI law. Presiding Officer, the committee recommends today's debate be used to set out plans to prioritise designations beyond that current consultation. Now, that's for a new government and a new parliament. But for my part, I can say that we would set out a programme of work for considering extension to private and third sector organisations delivering public services, drawing on issues raised in discussion of the current bill and working with stakeholders, including the Commissioner. There is no question, though, that FOI obligations place demands on resources, so we must take a well-considered and proportionate approach, ensuring any extension does not duplicate work and adds meaningfully to people's ability to access information without placing unreasonable burdens, particularly on smaller organisations. Presiding Officer, this Government is committed to strong FOI rights. We're consulting on extension of the legislation and laying a revised version of the statutory guidance for public authorities in Parliament before the end of the session. Again, my thanks to the committee, and I commend Katie Clark, who has restarted the debate on how we ensure that FOI legislation works well in Scotland. Presiding Officer.
Thank you. I now call on Richard Leonard.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It was the great French philosopher and civil rights campaigner Voltaire who warned, "Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good." And that is the crime we are being invited to commit in Parliament this afternoon. I've grown tired of members opting for inaction and mediocrity in place of action and ambition, or saying that we agree with these universal and immutable principles of democracy, of openness, transparency, accountability, but not here and not now. We know that the provision of public services has become a mixed economy, that outsourcing is rife, and it is because of that that if we are to update our freedom of information, improve the statutory right of access to it, advance the proactive publication of how public money is used, defend public interest journalism and challenge the existing structure of power, then we need to pass this reform bill today. Bodies, including many transnational private corporations which deliver public services with public money, should be covered by freedom of information. Of course they should. In fact, maybe that should be a condition of receiving public money or being awarded public contracts in the first place. And information, including data, should not just be published reactively, but proactively. It is not a burden, it is not red tape, it is not an inconvenience or a distraction, it is a democratic right. And what we should have learned down the years is that our security and our well-being does not spring from surreptitious secrecy, but from open democracy, which is why many of us see this bill as an important antidote to the corrosion of trust in public life. Now, I'm speaking in this debate this afternoon as a Labour Party representative, but my experience as the convener of the Parliament's Public Audit Committee is that there continue to be persistent data deficits and chronic information gaps right across the public sector in Scotland. That when we conducted our inquiry into the ferries order at Ferguson Marine, the Scottish Government's record-keeping, up to and including meetings taken by the then First Minister, left a lot to be desired. And we now know as well, because of the COVID public inquiry, of the deletion on an industrial scale of communications by SNP government ministers up to and including the current First Minister. So the culture change that this bill will help drive is not just out there, it's in here. and we know that publicity is the best disinfectant. And so to the Minister for Parliamentary Business and Veterans, who tells us this bill is timed out, I say, what about the government's COVID emergency legislation, which we passed in a matter of days in 2020? What about the government's deeply flawed building safety levy bill? Why is the Minister pressing ahead with that, finding the parliamentary time for that? And why is it the government can find parliamentary time to pass legislation to collect rates on empty properties in days, but there is no time to modernise our freedom of information laws in weeks? Well, this is a member's bill in the name of Katie Clark, who is to be congratulated for getting it on the Parliament's agenda and for winning the argument. But let me make it clear to the government, which seeks to wreck this bill today, that there is a movement out there demanding these reforms. It is a movement made up of campaigners who will not go away. So if Parliament does not pass this legislation tonight, if the government kills the bill today, it will return. We will see civil rights advance. We will see the veils of secrecy torn down by the people. We will see the triumph of hope and democracy. We will see the people empowered.
Thank you. I now call on Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It wouldn't be a Richard Leonard speech if it didn't begin with a quotation from a great philosopher, and if I'm lucky enough to be returned, I will miss those kind of comments. I hope somebody else will take up that tradition for him. I think sometimes in freedom of information we suffer actually from a perception that FOI is still a new system, a new regime. It's clearly of the modern age, but as Katie Clark pointed out in the opening speech, it is nearly a quarter of a century old since that system was designed. It was designed for an earlier era, both in terms of the way public services are delivered and also in terms of the way modern data collection happens. I suspect no one designing the FOI regime at the time would have been able to conceive of the sheer volume and breadth of data that public services collect and have to manage, and data that's now open to FOI. The case for reform, therefore, isn't new either. And again, as Katie Clark mentioned, the comments at the beginning of at the tail end of the previous session from the committee demonstrating clear weaknesses with the current legislative framework, and saying that the next Parliament, that's this session of Parliament, should robustly pursue the recommendations to ensure that the Scottish Government makes the necessary changes. Well, the Scottish Government didn't make those changes, and so I strongly commend Katie Clark for the work that she's done in bringing forward a member's bill to try and move things along. And I'll certainly be voting in favour of the general principles. So I thank her for her work. I thank the Government as well for engaging with me as a party that doesn't have a member of the lead committee. I took the time to engage with both the member and the minister, and I thank the committee for their work as well. I think it's regrettable that a member's bill was necessary to try and achieve progress, because if there is a general consensus that reform is needed, it would have been better delivered if we'd seen government legislation come forward. But the government has been slow to act, both in terms of bringing forward reform and slow to exercise the powers it already has in terms of extension of FOI to other bodies. And so I think, in particular, of the various elements of the bill that are before today, the granting of that power to Parliament, in addition to government, I think is one of the most important elements, as well as the shift on the focus toward proactive publication and measures to take action against the destruction of information. As far as the amendment goes, I do recognise the committee's concern, particularly where we are in these last 6 weeks or so of the parliamentary session. I think we all understand why we've got to where we are, and part of that, I say again, is on the government in its slowness to act. But I also understand the government's concern about balancing the need to have a system that balances the potential conflict of different legal duties. And I don't think that we would want to pass legislation that makes them unable to respect confidentiality, for example, or where there was a conflict between those duties and FOI duties. But we are where we are. I think this is going to be a missed opportunity. I think it's fairly clear that the amendment is likely to have the majority of support in the chamber. I'll be abstaining on it. The Greens will abstain on the amendment, but will vote in favour of the motion whether the amendment passes or not. But this will be a missed opportunity. This bill could have gone forward for scrutiny, even if only to save time in the next session. Finally, Presiding Officer, I'm afraid I don't have time. Finally, Presiding Officer, my party will make clear commitments. I think it's incumbent on every political party to make clear commitments, including the SNP. If they read the polls and expect to be returned as the government in the next session, it's going to be particularly important that they give a clear manifesto commitment about supporting a cross-party effort to bring forward the FOI reform that's so long overdue.
Thank you. I call Jamie Green. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you. When trust in politics is pretty much at an all-time low, I think we should all be doing everything we can to gain back that trust. I think it's a really bad look for any party, for any parliament, for any government to vote against extending the freedom of information rights. The Bill's Stage 1 report concluded by saying that whilst it agreed for the need for such reform that should have happened years ago, it did not consider this bill to be the most effective way of achieving it, and it also stated, as others have, that we just don't have the time to do so. Well, I completely disagree, Presiding Officer. The Scottish Liberal Democrats will be voting for this bill at Stage 1. Why? Because we think it provides a much overdue and much needed opportunity to make Scotland's public bodies more transparent. Public bodies that too often hide behind redactions and bureaucratic points about what is or is not covered in current, out-of-date legislation. You know, last year the Information Commissioner received nearly 600 appeals after members of the public were refused the information they'd asked for in FOIs. 30% of those were because the public body chose to withhold information. A further 35% were because the body failed to respond to the request at all, and 10% of those is because the public body claimed they did not even hold the information at all. That is ridiculous, and it's disgraceful. So Katie Clark's new crime of destroying records, for example, is much needed and much welcome. I believe the bill will resolve many of the outstanding issues with FOI legislation, no least because it will require public bodies to appoint a Freedom of Information officer, someone who can actually be held to account about the openness and transparency about their own organisation. And this all matters because it gives the public out there, it gives journalists and even us politicians the tools that we need to scrutinise public bodies in a way that no other method can. Let's be honest about it. Particularly when we submit parliamentary questions that are responded with by one-line answers. Mr Leonard talked about the Public Audit Committee, and some of the things that FOIs have helped us uncover have been on the front page of newspapers for months. The improper spending at the Water Industry Commission, the golden goodbyes at Ferguson Marine and Calmac, the cost overruns at the Cairngorm Funicular, the credit card spending sprees at Historic Environment Scotland, all of that uncovered under FOI. And Katie Clark's bill will strengthen the ability of all committees and all members to properly scrutinise decisions that are made, no least through the creation of a presumption in favour of disclosure. Now, look, I'm not saying the FOIs always give you good data. My latest FOI about CalMac payoffs, page 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, all redacted. So FOIs aren't the be-all and end-all, but underneath that is information that we ought to have access to, Presiding Officer. I should say I am surprised by the Conservatives' reasoned amendment today, because all it's done, whether they meant it or not, is simply hand the government a get-out-of-jail card on this issue. I just don't have time, unless I get some time back, Presiding Officer. I'm afraid I'm getting a no. I appreciate that the Parliament will not have enough time to progress this bill in this session, but that's not the fault of Katie Clark. It is a problem with this Parliament, and it's a problem with the government. So I would gently suggest to the Conservatives, withdraw your amendment or vote against it. I know it's a bit unorthodox, but I've done it myself. It's a bit awkward, but on this occasion it will be worth it, because I want to see this bill progress. I'm going to finish with what I started with at the beginning of my speech. It will take more than a bill to repair trust in public bodies. But I will say this, killing off this bill today will send a message to the public that we were simply not up to the challenge. And that is not a message that the Lib Dems are willing to send today. So we will support the bill, we will vote against the reasoned amendment, and I plead with the Chamber to do the same. Presiding Officer.
Thank you. We now move to the open debate. I call first George Adam, to follow by Mercedes Vialba. Up to 4 minutes, Mr Adam.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'd like to thank Katie Clark for how she's gone about the business of this Members' Bill. Trying to sum up my thoughts on FOI in 4 minutes is going to be difficult, but I'll be brutally honest with everybody with regards to it. And I suppose at this stage I should mention that I was the Minister who was in post when Katie Clark originally published her bill, and I was at the same FOI conference, and I gave up some of my ideas of how we went forward, and Katie Clark proposed hers. And it's still my opinion, and it's something that I've said before, is that the current FOI regime, which has been in place for 20 years, remains fundamentally sound. It does give a strong and enforceable right to know how government and other public services operate, while at the same time building safeguards to protect genuine sensitive information. Now, these are things, Presiding Officer, I've already said on numerous times before. However, let me be clear in the outset, I'm not against the idea of openness or reform of FOI. You know, some media outlets, when I was the Minister, probably would have reported otherwise, but that was a them problem, not a me problem. You know, the question before us today is whether this bill in this form is the right vehicle to deliver that change, and many people have said that in their contributions today, and whether the Parliament has enough certainty about what it would mean in practice across the public sector. The evidence heard by the committee has repeatedly returned to one central issue: cost, burden and uncertainty. The bill goes well beyond small technical adjustments to introduce new statutory obligations across the public sector, including requirements around proactive publication, which incidentally I always believed is something that as a government we should have always done in the first place anyway. Compliance monitoring and appointment of FOI officers. Whether the actual intention of these changes was the real consequences for staffing, training, governance and digital infrastructure, and we cannot pretend that these consequences just disappear into existing budgets as they stand. In the material provided to the committee, the Scottish Government set out its case that Section 60 Code is good practice guidance, but that the bill would introduce new statutory duties beyond the current practice, including a legal duty on proactive publication under Enforceable Publication Code and the designation of FOI officers with defined responsibilities. My argument would be that we are at this stage where we already have public organisations that have people that are doing this, but the important thing for us is to ensure that when we're talking about culture change and how we get organisations, will it be the Scottish Government, will it be local authorities, will it be other FOI-able organisations, as the culture change is what we always talk about. And in order to do that culture change, it's to get beyond this idea that it's just it's an addition to their job. FOI isn't an addition to a job. It's part of your job. It's something you have to do. It's a legal requirement. But at the same time, we have to get that balance, that we don't take people away from their core duties and their core jobs. Because I know the challenge in Scottish Government to try and ensure that we got the 95% required to actually get the FOIs back in time. So that's the important things. And what doesn't help is when you live in a political environment where you've got the likes of Douglas Lumpson, FOI, AI generated around 1,300 over 4 months. That's 987 in January in 2025 alone, and that cost £185,000. So that's the kind of thing that you've got to be very careful about as well, Presiding Officer. So, Presiding Officer, in closing, let me finish on this point. Nobody in this chamber should be satisfied with the status quo in areas where improvement is needed. The question isn't should we reform, but how we reform. We must do this with the evidence in front of us. We must do it with the costs properly understood and in a way that strengthens openness in practice, not just in paper. That is the responsible approach, Presiding Officer. That is the workable approach, and that's why I don't support this bill at this stage.
Thank you. And I call Mercedes Vialba to be followed by Graham Simpson. Up to 4 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And let me begin by thanking my friend and comrade Katie Clark for taking up the challenge of reforming our freedom of information laws to be fit for the 21st century. The Freedom of Information Scotland Act 2002 was significant in that it gave everyone the right to obtain information held by public authorities. Yet, as Katie has rightly highlighted, this law has not kept pace with the level of outsourcing to private companies of our public services. In effect, our right to know has been stripped back. Take buses, for example. In Edinburgh, the buses are owned and operated by Lothian Buses. Publicly owned, Lothian is the UK's largest municipal bus company, and as such, it is rightly subject to freedom of information requests. Yet elsewhere, First Bus, owned by First Group plc, is not subject to freedom of information laws, despite receiving huge sums of public money. So if you live out with the capital, you have no right to know about your local bus service. This Parliament has a duty to change that. And it's not just bus companies who've been allowed to avoid public scrutiny. In energy, we've seen the vast majority of money from the Scottish Government's Just Transition Fund siphoned off to the private sector. Over 40% of this fund has gone to organisations linked to billionaire oil tycoon Sir Ian Wood. All while energy workers lose their jobs and are forced to pay out of pocket to retrain. Without this vital freedom of information legislation, the public will have no right to ask questions about how this money is being spent. How can the Scottish Government justify this? What are they hiding? Who are they protecting? And isn't it time Scotland had a government that will work in the interest of the people rather than those of big business, billionaires and barons? Presiding Officer, the COVID pandemic exposed the hard reality of how few government decisions across the world truly serve the people they are supposed to represent. A harrowing example, which brought this point home to many, was the care home scandal. And I would like to highlight the tireless work of former MSP Neil Findlay, both inside and outside this chamber, on this issue. Because as members will remember, many people across the country spent their final days alone in care homes as part of a botched plan to free up hospital beds. Due to this outsourcing, families of the bereaved cannot make a freedom of information request regarding where their loved ones spent their final days. Yet if they had remained in hospital, they could have made a freedom of information request. This is another example of where the current FOI law is simply not strong enough. For victims, for workers, for the travelling public and many more, we need FOI reform. We need Katie Clark's Members' Bill. I'll conclude, Presiding Officer, with this point. Clearly, the Scottish Government recognise this need, as they are now running consultations on extending FOI to care homes. So if they agree current FOI law is inadequate, and if they recognise the injustice being faced by the public seeking crucial information, why on earth wouldn't they support this timely bill today? I commend this bill to Parliament, and I thank Katie Clark for bringing it forward.
Thank you. Point of order, Stu Webber.
Briefly, Presiding Officer, the member in her remarks stated that Lothian Buses was owned by Lothian Buses. Perhaps you may want to correct the record and state that it's actually owned by a number of local authorities. Thank you.
Thank you. Not a point of order, but it's on the record. I call final speaker in the open debate, Graham Simpson, up to 3 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm very grateful, and I want to start by also congratulating Katie Clark for getting the bill to this stage. But I have to say I do feel for her after what she must have thought was quite a negative report from the committee, which arrived at the conclusion that the government should legislate in this area. And I have to say, as I said before in an intervention, that the government had the opportunity, as they do with all members' bills, to take it on, and they chose not to. Now, the member proceeded because the government didn't. And it's perhaps not surprising, because we have a government which is addicted to secrecy, so it's chosen not to legislate in an area which could herald a new era of transparency. Now, the committee convener thanked the member for her valuable contribution. Well, it has been valuable, but if we were to follow the committee's advice and wait for the government, and then potentially wait for the committee to do something, we could be waiting for years and years, and we could be at the end of the next session of Parliament before anything happens. So, we've really got to pass this at this stage. The policy memorandum sets out that the main aim of the bill is to improve transparency in Scotland by strengthening existing measures in the Act. The committee agreed that there is a need for freedom of information reform. They agreed with that. And surely we're here today to decide whether we agree with the aims of the bill rather than the detail. I always understood that to be what stage one is about. The details come later. So I can quite comfortably say that I agree with the general principles of the bill while having concerns about elements of it. That's not the point. I've supported Katie Clark on this throughout. I've attended events put on by her and the Campaign for Freedom of Information in Scotland. George Adam, as he said earlier, was at one of those, and it was at one such event in Glasgow that I met the late Lord Wallace, who was a strong supporter of what the member is trying to do. The Act came into force just over 20 years ago, so surely now is the right time to update it and improve its provisions. The bill addresses shortcomings in the current legislation identified by campaigners, journalists and members of the public. Presiding Officer, we've got the chance to end the years of secret Scotland and bring the country into the light of disclosure. Let us take it.
Thank you. We now come to closing speeches. I call first Patrick Harvey. Up to 4 minutes. Mr Harvey.
Well, I may not use all of that time, Presiding Officer. I'm not sure I have a huge amount more to add beyond my opening speech, but I will reiterate that I think if we don't progress with this bill, it will be a missed opportunity. I would like to say that I think there is probably more consensus on this topic than some of the more extreme rhetoric might suggest. I know there will always be those who think that the current government of the day is somehow, overly secretive and corrupt and all of the rest of this kind of stuff. This hyperbole is nonsense. I think most of us know that it's nonsense. But I think the current government has been slow to act, and it is regrettable that it's taken a member's bill to try to move things on. I think there's consensus across the chamber that we need a regime that's fit for the 21st century, I think was the phrase Mercedes Villalba used, and that the system that we have at the moment is not that. Whether that's in relation to the changing patterns of outsourcing of public services, as the member mentioned, whether it's around the scale of the data that's collected and the nature of that information, whether it is around not just the issues of today's use of AI, but the issues that we will encounter as AI becomes more proliferating through our society, and that again will change the expectations and the needs of the FOI regime. And I think also the cultural expectations that we have as a society have been changed by COVID, amongst other things, and all of the inquiry process that came out of that. I think more people have reflected and considered and changed their views of what information should be kept, what information actually shouldn't be allowed to be kept about us as individuals or about us as communities. What's the balance between transparency and confidentiality? And how can we have an FOI regime that ensures that the powerful are held accountable for the way they exercise their power? All of these things have changed since the system was designed and will continue to change. And that's why the powers to adapt and to continue to develop the FOI regime need to be able to be used more flexibly. And I would say again, to be used by Parliament, not just at a time when government is ready. There will continue to be a tension between the urgency of action and the need to take time to consider all of the details and the issues that members have raised. I close, Presiding Officer, by saying again that if this missed opportunity does happen and we are left with the expectation of a Section 7 committee bill being the vehicle, It must be taken forward with momentum. It's going to have to be a year 1 commitment, not a year 5 commitment in the next session of the Scottish Parliament. And I hope that the Minister, when he closes, will be able to give a clear commitment on behalf of his party. What will they be saying in the manifesto in a few weeks' time about their commitments, not only to legislate if they're in government, but to do so on a cross-party basis across Parliament?
Thank you. I now call Daniel Johnson. Up to 4 minutes, Mr Johnson.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. Patrick Harvey, in his summing up there, poured a bit of scorn on those that like to claim that the Scottish Government wants to be secretive or sit on information. And I would just gently say that that's almost certainly what a former minister would say, if I could be somewhat impish. But I think he made a number of good remarks, and I think his point that overall there is a consensus about the need for reform and to update freedom of information is absolutely correct. And in that regard, I think Katie Clark is to be congratulated for taking forward what is not just an important bill, but one that is certainly technical and not one that is trivial in any regard. And I think she deserves a great deal of credit for that. And indeed, I thank the committee for their work. I think at the heart of this actually is about what kind of parliament, what kind of politics, what kind of government do we want, do we claim we have, and the one we really have. And I think the two contributions this afternoon that I think were most important were Jamie Green's and Richard Leonard's. Because I think Jamie Green, in his contribution, actually highlighted the reality for those seeking to gain information from freedom of information. And frankly, most people find it a battle. The constant reasons why information cannot be revealed, the swathes of paper, and we're not allowed props, but I did catch a glimpse of what he was holding. Frankly, huge amounts of toner wasted on the redactions for those that seek to print them out. That is not good enough. Frankly, FOI is in a state where people are losing trust because of the secrecy and the reluctance to divulge information. And Richard Leonard was absolutely right, because this is about principle. And I think two very important principles. The first of all leads directly to democracy itself. If we seek to have democracy, we must have openness and transparency, because after all, this is the public's money they entrust with us to spend wisely. And the only way that they can have trust and confidence is if they have clear transparency and openness on how that money is being spent. But I think, as importantly as that, is actually how government is making decisions on our behalf. Understanding those principles, the reasons, the information and the way those decisions are being made. And this isn't just about secrecy. Actually, this is about good decision-making. And I think the ferry fiasco shines a great deal of light on that. The fact that it transpired that email chains were being used as evidence of decision-making, second-hand accounts of conversations being held with ministers. It is not good enough, and we have to shine a light on poor decision-making like that. So I commend the approach taken in the bill to first follow the money, as it were. Where public money is being spent, whether by the public sector or by the private sector, we have to have accountability. There has to be a presumption of disclosure, frameworks that seek to proactively disclose information, removing exemptions, caveats and vetoes. That has to be the right way to proceed. So today, it looks as though the government may prevail in not allowing this bill to proceed, and that will be a great shame. So the question for Parliament is this: how do we want to proceed? Because this must proceed. I think it would be an error to vote against this bill this afternoon. There may be a great deal of detail to be worked out, but at least it would be progress, something to be taken up by the next Parliament. And I would just ask this further question. I don't believe that actually the Scottish Government necessarily is the best body to take this forward. I think Parliament needs to think about how we could take this forward collectively on a cross-party basis, because ultimately this is about scrutiny and accountability. That is the business of Parliament. That is how I think this should be approached in the next Parliament if this does not proceed today. But we have an opportunity to take this forward. We all agree that it should be taken forward, and I urge members to vote for this bill at stage 1 this evening. Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer.
I now call Annie Wells. Up to 4 minutes, Ms Wells.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. When people submit a Freedom of Information request, they are not making a political statement. They are usually asking something very ordinary. Who took this decision? Why was this contract awarded? And how was this money spent? Our responsibility in this Parliament is to ensure the law behind those requests actually works, not just in theory, but in practice. There is no dispute that Scotland's FOI framework needs to keep pace with how public services now operate. The way information is created, stored and shared has changed dramatically since 2002. Public services are delivered through increasingly complex arrangements, often involving arm's length bodies, contractors and hybrid organisations. The legislation has not kept pace. That is why I want to begin by recognising the work that Katie Clark has done by bringing this bill forward. She's forced Parliament to confront questions that have been left unanswered for far too long. That in itself is a valuable contribution and it deserves acknowledgement. But recognising efforts does not remove our responsibility to scrutinise outcomes. The evidence presented to the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee was clear on one central point. While reform is needed, I don't believe this bill yet provides the workable or reliable route to delivering it. The committee was not persuaded that legislating for a general presumption in favour of disclosure would materially change behaviour. It was unconvinced that replacing publication schemes with a broad proactive publication duty would achieve the cultural shift needed. And it raised serious concerns also, Presiding Officer, about whether the proposed designation powers and enforcement mechanisms were sufficiently developed or practical. And, Presiding Officer, these are not minor technical points. They go to the heart of whether this legislation would actually improve access to information or simply create new uncertainty for public bodies and frustration for the public. That is why the amendment lodged in my colleague Sue Webber's name is so important. The amendment recognises the legitimate desire for reform while making clear that this bill in its current form cannot be the final answer. It provides a clearer framework for how reform should be approached and sends a strong signal that responsibility ultimately rests with the Scottish Government to bring forward comprehensive, workable legislation. Presiding Officer, Parliament is under real pressure in this debate. There is increasing public frustration about access to information and growing criticism of institutions that appear closed or opaque. And in that context, it would be easy to present this debate as a binary choice, transparency or against it. And that framing is misleading. Supporting transparency means getting the law right. It means ensuring reform is deliverable, properly resourced and capable of being implemented consistently across public sectors. That is why this amendment matters so much. And if it passes, it allows Parliament to acknowledge the need for reform while being honest about the limitations of this bill. It strengthens the message that this work cannot end here. Presiding Officer, freedom of information underpins trust in public life. That trust is too important to be dealt with through uncertainty or delay. And this debate should send a strong signal. Change is absolutely needed. Parliament is ready to engage and the next session government must deliver FOI legislation that truly works in practice. And to answer Jamie Green's question, we will vote for this bill at stage 1 on the general principles, whether my colleague Sue Webber's amendment goes through or not, because this conversation has to continue. And once again, I thank Sue Clark for this work.
Thank you very much indeed. Then I call the Minister. Up to 4 minutes, Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I want to thank all members who contributed to this afternoon's debate, whether I've agreed or disagreed with them entirely or partially. Richard Leonard made a typically passionate and thoughtful speech, and there is no doubt we're going to miss Richard, or the Parliament in the next session will miss Richard Leonard, because like him I won't be here. But the answer to his question on why we could not progress the bill to a conclusion in this session was actually provided a few moments earlier by the convener, when he talked about the need for further consultation on key aspects of the proposals, the speculative nature of the financial memorandum, and concerns, for example, over the creation of an offence for deliberate destruction of information. The fact is, Presiding Officer, there simply is not time to do this properly. It's easy to say we should find the time. Finding it is a completely different matter. Are members suggesting we scrap other business to facilitate this bill and deal with it perhaps as a committee of the whole Parliament? What business would be scrapped? Or are they suggesting that somehow the Parliament orders the Standards Committee to drop everything else it's doing currently? I suspect the convener might have something to say about that. And it's certainly a change of position that we've heard today from two parties who are represented on the committee. The committee made clear in its recommendations that the Stage 1 general principle should not be supported, as they did not consider the bill to be the most effective vehicle to deliver the changes desired, and that due to lack of time for the necessary policy development to be completed, the Parliament should not agree to the principles of the bill at Stage 1. Now, we, the Government, have followed the committee's recommendation not to support the bill at Stage 1 based on their report. Indeed, Sue Webber has taken the unusual step of bringing forward a reasoned amendment to point out the lack of time. Therefore, I'm slightly confused as to what the Conservatives and Labour Party, who are both represented, as I say, on the committee, want to do. They now seem to want to pass the bill at Stage 1, but they acknowledge there's insufficient time for the necessary development of the bill. But, of course, to be clear, by passing the bill at Stage 1, this will go forward to the next parliamentary stage. I will.
Daniel Johnson.
I'm very grateful. I mean, first of all, I would note that members are encouraged to leave their party hats at the door. But that notwithstanding, what we're being asked to consider, and Parliament is always asked to consider, is about the purposes and general purposes of the bill. If Parliament then subsequently runs out of time, that is another matter. But does it not send an odd signal to vote against this bill, but actually suggesting that our successor Parliament takes up the issue? I find that strange. I wonder if the Minister could answer that.
Minister, I give this back.
So I recognise the point that Daniel Johnson seeks to make. But we are 5 weeks out from the conclusion of the Parliament. And someone talked earlier about the public out there looking in. What this action on the part of some of the parties seeks to do is to raise an expectation that absolutely cannot be fulfilled. And I would contend that it's more sensible, pragmatic, practical for all of us, as I think we have done today, because there is more that unites us than divides us on this issue, to come forward and say, yes, we recognise that there is insufficient time to use this vehicle, which the committee has agreed is not the appropriate vehicle. My apologies, I have very little time, Mr Green, genuine apologies, and come together to acknowledge that there is an opportunity in the next Parliament, whether it's with the Government leading it or, as Mr Whitfield has suggested quite innovatively, a committee of the Parliament doing that. There's an opportunity to point the way, I think, to that, recognising the shortcomings of the bill, but also the positives that are in the bill. There's some good stuff in the bill which the Government has acknowledged in its response to the committee. So, Presiding Officer, I'm very conscious of time. Freedom of information is, of course, only one part of how we can build a more participative democracy in Scotland. The values of openness and participation certainly require the wide provision of official information. These values also entail government and public services to be approachable, responsive and accountable to the people they serve. Throughout this session, the Scottish Government has sought to progress those wider values to its open government agenda. And as someone who started the session as a minister, took 14 months out, then returned to government, I can attest to the progress on that. Presiding Officer, in light of the committee's recommendation, the Scottish Government will still be opposing the bill today. However, this does not detract from our commitment to robust FOI law in Scotland or for our openness to engagement on a cross-party basis on its further development. Presiding Officer.
Thank you. I now call on Katie Clark, the member in charge, to wind up the debate. Up to 5 minutes, please.
Officer, this Parliament was founded on the principles of accountability, openness and transparency. And this bill gives us the opportunity to build on those principles today. I've outlined the process which led to the provisions in the bill that we're considering today, and this bill is the correct starting point. I thank the committee for the scrutiny they undertook in preparing their Stage 1 report. I thank all the stakeholders who engaged with the process. I thank Carol Hewitt from the Campaign for Freedom of Information in Scotland and my office for all the work that they have done on the bill. And I also thank the Information Commissioner, his team, for their engagement, and indeed all the former Information Commissioners who have engaged with this process. The only issue we have before us today is whether we agree the general principles of this bill at Stage 1. Yeah. I have listened carefully to the contributions of members in today's debate, and there seems to be a consensus that the public's right to information is important, that there must be accountability in public service delivery and transparency in the use of public money. But we have to recognise that our current freedom of information regime has been in place for more than 2 decades, and that the public, campaigners, organisations and government have all experienced how that works, where it works well and what needs to change. And that's why the current Information Commissioner and his predecessors support this bill. That's why this bill enjoys the support from so many organisations, and so much of the evidence that was submitted supported that bill. From trade unions, from care home relative campaigners, from the third sector and from many, many others. I'll respond to some of the specific points that were made in the debate to do with the specific provisions. On new designations, I agree with Daniel Johnson. This is also about the kind of Parliament we want to have. It would not have been appropriate to put more detail in the bill on the process for designation, which would be a matter for standing orders of this Parliament. But we have to say that the role of this Parliament is to hold the Scottish Government to account, and given that the Scottish Government over more than 2 decades have failed to keep this Parliament in a place where freedom of information is in the place it should be, it is appropriate that the committee structure and this Parliament give itself more powers. The creation of the Freedom of Information Officer role comes from Freedom of Information officers themselves. I know the Minister and his predecessor attend the annual events which so many Freedom of Information officers attend, and they will have heard them explain that they believe this would give them the power to enforce freedom of information within their own organisation. Many of them are data protection officers, and they believe that this legislation, which mirrors the provision of the data protection regime, would enable them to be able to get their organisations to comply with the law. The Section 18 proposal of the new criminal offence is designed to deal with serious situations and is one that the Information Commissioner has said would enable them to do their job better, where information is deliberately destroyed with the intent to avoid the law. The vast majority of the public support the key principles of this bill, and that's why we must agree the general principles today. The way in which public services are delivered has changed significantly since the 2002 Act. Multinationals like Serco, G4S and Mighty are now providing public services and in receipt of public funding, and we no longer have the information rights that we had for those services in 2002. If these services were still being provided by government, they would be subjected to freedom of information laws. Scottish ministers have consistently failed to come forward with legislative proposals to this Parliament, and when I met with the Minister on Thursday, yet again, he said that his view was that legislative change was not needed. As outlined in my opening speech, the committee has indicated support to many provisions of this bill. I'm disappointed with the amendment that has been put down. I believe a very clear message should be put forward by this Parliament today that we vote. I'm not sure if I can because I'm over
I can
time.
take a very,
but if
very
the
brief
presiding
one
officer allows me.
Sue Webber, briefly.
Presented today does not prevent this proceeding, as many members across the chamber have made and remarked against. It just makes it very clear that we have got a very challenging timeline. Practical and common sense, that's just Sue Webber all over it, but never mind.
Katie Clark.
What before the Parliament today is on the general principles of this bill. This Parliament should be sending a clear message, the strongest message, that this Parliament supports legislative reform of the freedom of information regime, and that means clearly supporting the general principles of this bill today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Clark. That concludes the debate on the Freedom of Information Reform Scotland Bill at Stage 1. There will be a brief pause before we move to the next item of business to allow front benches to change. Point of order, Jamie Green.
I appreciate I won't take up much time. There's a lot to get through this afternoon, but it has become very clear over the course of the debate that there seems to be confusion about what will happen to this bill at the next stage. If the general principles are agreed to, as seems to have been suggested by members, and the reasoned amendment which does call for it to be considered in the next session of Parliament, not this session, will the bill progress to stage 2, yes or no? It's entirely unclear. I wonder if the Chair could offer some advice on that.
I can confirm, Mr Green, that the bill would go forward in the event of the amendment being passed. The only decisions that Parliament can take at stage 2 are either to vote against the general principles of the bill or to allow the bill to proceed. It's then a matter for the committee and Parliament what happens thereafter.